Okay, hi everyone. I think we're gonna go ahead and start. There's a couple people still trickling in, but thanks for being here bright and early on Saturday morning, and welcome to the second day of the conference. Our last panel is called Confluences and Cartographies. I'm Laura Weiss. I'm the managing editor at NACLA. So on the panel today, we have Fernando Camacho Padilla, who wrote an essay called Teaching Latin America in Tehran. Fernando is from Seville, Spain. He has a double PhD in history from the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid and the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He's been an assistant lecturer at the Universidad Autónoma de Madrid since 2015. His most recent book is A Life for Chile, Solidarity and the Chilean Community in Sweden. Marwan M. Kraidy wrote an essay for NACLA called A Tale of Two Modernities. He is the Anthony Shadid Chair in Global Media, Politics, and Culture, and the Director of the Center for Advanced Research in Global Communications at the University of Pennsylvania. He studies the relationship between culture and geopolitics, theories of identity and modernity, and global media systems and industries. His most recent book, The Naked Blogger of Cairo, Creative Insurgency in the Arab World, was published by Harvard University Press in 2016. We also have Alejandro Velasco, who, as you know, is the executive editor of NACLA. He co-wrote an essay with Omar Dahi called Latin America-Middle East Ties in the New Global South. Alejandro is also an associate professor of modern Latin America at New York University. His research involves social movements, urban culture, and democratization in Latin America. He received his PhD in history from Duke University in 2009. His first book, Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela, was published by the University of California Press in 2015 and won the Fernando Coronil Award for Best Book on Venezuela from the Latin American Studies Association. Omar Dahi is Associate Professor of Economics at Hampshire College and a visiting fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace Middle East Center, where he coordinates research initiatives on Syrian refugees and reconstruction. His research focuses on the political economy of South-South trade and has appeared in the Journal of Development Economics, Middle East Report, Dissent, and Review of Radical Political Economics, among others. His latest book with Firat Demir is South-South Trade and Finance in the 21st Century, Rise of the South, or Second Great Divergence. He's an editor of MERIP, co-convener of this conference. Finally, we have Kevon Harris, who wrote an article in MERIP called Divergent Histories and Converging Inequalities in the Middle East and Latin America. He is an assistant professor of sociology at UCLA and an editor of MERIP. His research projects focus on welfare politics in low and middle income countries, business-state relations in Iran, and the history of social policy in West Asia and North Africa, and class and social mobility in Iran before and after 1979. His first book, A Social Revolution, Politics and the Welfare State in Iran, was published by the University of California Press in 2017. Our discussant is Ali Mirsapasi, who is a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at NYU Gallatin and in the Department of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies in the Faculty of Arts and Science, NYU. He is also director of the Iranian Studies Initiative at NYU. In addition, he's an affiliated faculty in the Sociology Department. His teaching and research interests include social theories of modernity, Iranian intellectual history, political Islam, modern Islamic thought, and the sociology of religion. His most recent book, Transnationalism in Iranian Political Thought, The Life and Thought of Ahmad Fardid, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2017. So without further ado, Fernando is going to start.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Alejandro, Omar, Sinan, Alara, for giving me the opportunity to be here sharing my teaching experience in Iran with you. It's going to be something new for me to talk just about my own activities in Iran, because usually I have a more scholar perspective of my research, and this will be more about me and my work with Iranian students and teachers. but I hope maybe we'll find interesting in order to understand these efforts I have been making since 2011 to make academic connections between the Spanish universities, especially mine, Universidad Autónoma Madrid, with a couple Iranian universities. To start, well, this is the content of my presentation. I will make some references to the situation of the Spanish-speaking world at the Iranian universities. Some of the main references the Iranian students have is by the Spanish-speaking world, then the different channels from this information and cultural information from the Spanish-speaking countries arrive to Iran, students' expectations, and then a little bit of information about my academic collaboration. I will prefer to focus on the Spanish-speaking world because I don't teach about Brazil and I don't teach about the Guayanas either. Most of my work is related to the Spanish-speaking world. And for the Iranians, it's very difficult to make a difference between Argentina and Spain. Usually when they study Spanish-speaking literature, they study Borges and Antonio Machado, for example. And when they study the history of the Spanish-speaking world, they don't make difference between Latin America and Spanish-speaking country of Europe as Spain. So I think it's more appropriate to use this term for my presentation. Actually, only 3 universities offer Spanish language courses: the University of Tehran, Alameda Batavia University, and then a private university, because the first 2 are public, is Islamic Azad University. Usually the best students are located in the first 2 because there is an entrance exam which is very difficult to pass. And if they do so, they can choose between the first and the second university, while for the third one, any student who wishes to study Spanish can join as soon as he pays or she pays. They only offer 1 Master of Arts in Latin American Studies at the University of Tehran. The other ones are planning, especially Alameda Batavia, to have a Master of Arts in Spanish translation. And they're planning also to have a doctoral program, but we'll see what happens. Most of the courses are related to linguistics and literature. Very few include the history of Spain or the Spanish-speaking countries of the Americas, mostly in the Alameda Batavia and also the University of Tehran. And also, of course, it's possible to find some different language schools all around the country where they also offer Spanish language courses. Most of the teachers hold PhDs in literature and linguistics. None of them actually hold a PhD in Latin American studies or history or political science. So in the University of Tehran, most of the teachers who teach at the Latin American studies master, they come from abroad. They invite teachers from Spain or other Latin American countries, or they are also Iranian diplomats who have been on a mission in Latin America, and then they teach a little bit about what they have read and studied while they were working in this part of the world. Here's just some posters, one of the activities they have organized at the University of Tehran a few years ago. Which are the typical references among the Iranian students about the Spanish-speaking world? So this is something we talked a little bit yesterday, but I would like to highlight some of the, I don't know, maybe most frequent cultural presence in Iran. For example, I mean, yesterday I mentioned soccer, and it's very important. Spanish soccer is everywhere in Iran. I mean, you run into a coffee shop and people are watching the different games from the Spanish league. This one is not Messi. It's an Iranian man who looks like Messi, and he takes pictures with people in Iran. And there is another Iranian who looks very much like Cristiano Ronaldo, and he also takes pictures with Iranian people on the streets. Then Spanish fashion. You go to Tehran and you find most of the Spanish brands, Mango, Zara, and other shops, which are very popular, especially among Iranian girls. This is the Mango shop in Tehran. Food, of course, this is some sort of Tex-Mex restaurant in Tehran, which is very popular, Limon. You can read here modern Latin cuisine. Music, especially flamenco. I mean, this poster, of course, is before revolution. They will be legal now. You see it's from 1971, but already at the time of the Shah, flamenco was very big. And now a lot of concerts organized by the Spanish embassy, as the ones you can see here. Also, the problem with flamenco is women cannot dance in Iran and they cannot sing. So, of course, they're always men. Spanish artists or Latin American artists are always men who go to and travel in Iran. This is also some sort of a cultural project to mix flamenco music with Iranian poetry, with Omar Khayyam, some of Omar Khayyam's most famous poems. Art will be maybe the fifth reference. This is like a normal shop in one of the shopping malls in Tehran, and here we can see Frida Kahlo, for example. Frida Kahlo is very popular in Iran because the color she uses in her art, and also Iranian art has a lot of, is also very colorful. So you can see this combination of both artists. Also, we can find very interesting Spanish and Latin American pre-Columbian art at the Johann Nama Museum, which is located in Yavaran Palace. It was the most modern palace built by the Shah before the revolution. And today, part of the palace is an art gallery, and you can find not only pre-Columbian artifacts like the one here you can see from the Moche culture from the Andes, but also paintings from Dalí, Miró, Picasso, and other artists, contemporary Spanish artists. Also at the Contemporary Art Museum of Tehran, you find some very important paintings. This art was arrived in Tehran before the revolution. Faradiva was very much concerned about buying these Spanish art or pre-Columbine archaeology artifacts. So a lot of Iranians, when they go to the museums they have in Tehran, they see this art. And I think that's something unique in the Middle East. I've been in many museums in the Middle East, and I've never seen Picasso's or Dalí or pre-Columbian archaeology artifacts like the ones here. Also, we cannot understand the cultural connection without the translation of García Lorca, the one you can see here. Pablo Neruda is also very popular. And the last one is Bolaño. Recently, one of the Borges books has been translated into Farsi as well. But as someone said yesterday, we have to consider that some of these translations come from French, from English, or even from German. Very few come from Spanish language. This one comes from Spanish language. It's made by Nazmé Chauvery, one teacher in Spanish literature at the Alameda Batavia University. This one is by another teacher. The other ones I don't know. But it's important to check where the translation is coming from. Then also, it's important the representation of women in the Spanish-speaking world movies in Iran. And right now, there is this collaboration between the Mexican and the Spanish embassy, and you can see the movie they are showing. They are very concerned of the role of the woman in the movie they show to the Iranian society. I mean, they're very religious, and the women are also covering their hair. They don't want to, for somehow, provoke the Iranian authorities. So they're very careful with the movies they show at the embassies. Then, of course, politics, Latin American politics, but not all Latin American politics. They only know about their friends they have in Latin America. This picture was taken 5 years ago, and it made a big discussion in Iran, because here we can see Ahmadinejad holding Chavez's mother hands. And as you know, Iranian men are not allowed to touch women which are not related to in public. So there was a big discussion in Iran, and everyone also, well, they knew who Hugo Chavez was, but after this picture, even they knew much better. And also the connection between Al-Andalus and Persia. Here is a picture from the Alhambra. Here's a picture of an Iranian palace, and especially because some researchers say that Persian architects came to Al-Andalus in order to build up the Alhambra gardens. You can say it's a typical Persian garden. And it's a very interesting book in order to understand this connection between Al-Andalus and Persia. And then also in Tehran you can find names of different places are related to Latin America. The Argentinian Square, Simon Bolivar Square, and there are also other Latin American names related to the urban nomenclature in Tehran. Then, how this information comes through Iran? Mostly, and we cannot deny that, from the United States. A lot of movies coming from the United States. A lot of Iranians who live here in the United States, in Canada, or even in Australia, who go back to Iran. Then they decide maybe to open a Tex-Mex restaurant. Actually, many Latin American women who live in Iran, they are married to Iranians because they met here in the United States. Latin American migrants, mostly women, marry Iranian men here, and then they move back He moved back to Iran, and she follows him. And then she converts into Islam, and then she learns Farsi, and then maybe she starts to work as a Spanish language teacher. Also, Spain plays an important role. Other European countries where there is a big Iranian community, such as France, England, Great Britain, or even Sweden. I was teaching in Sweden for 9 years, and I met a lot of Iranians, and many Iranians went to Spain for vacation or even to Latin America, and they also go to Iran. Minority groups, that's something important. A lot of Armenians from Iran moved to Argentina before and after the revolution. Many of them also, well, not many, but few of them went back to Iran, and now they teach Spanish, and they're Christian Armenians. And also Iranian tourists. Spain now receives a lot of Iranian tourists. And Jews also play an important role. Here is the Armenian cathedral in Tehran, and this is the Armenian community in Buenos Aires. Future expectation for the students. Many of them, they would like to move to Spain and work in Spain. Maybe some other would like to work for Spanish companies in Iran. Others would like to work with Spanish tourists in Iran. Some students, they study Spanish only for their own personal interest. Depends. And also, there is the possibility of working for the Hispan TV. It's an Iranian TV channel, which is Spanish spoken, and it broadcasts all around the world, especially Latin America and Spain. And it's very political, but they also have cultural programs. And about my academic collaboration, and now we'll finish with this. Since 2011, I've been working with a lot of agreements. Now we offer different scholarships to Iranian students to come to any of the 4 universities which are part of the Alliance for University from Spain. And also Spanish students and teachers can go to Iran now to teach or follow different courses. So this is a big step on the academic relation. Before there was nothing done between Spain and Latin America, Spain and Iran. The Spanish government used to offer some scholarship for Iranian PhD, but after the economical crisis that finished. So for a few years, no one actually could come to Spain. In this link, you can see some picture of my last activity organized in Madrid, just 1 month ago. Last year, I have organized this Congress of Iranology. And this is also one poster of another of the activities I organized in Iran last year, both in Farsi and Spanish. And this is like a picture of the classroom where this activity was held. And here we can see some of the ambassadors from the Latin American countries, the ambassador from Nicaragua, the ambassador from Mexico, the diplomat from the Uruguayan embassy, Venezuela, and the ambassador from Ecuador. And we were discussing this Latin America-Iran political relation and cultural relation today. And next year, we're going to publish a book with the different presentation which took place in Tehran December last year. Thank you very much.
I want to first begin by, of course, thanking the organizer, Alejandro, Amar, Sinan, Laura, and Sam for their help, for the invitation, for their patience with me. And I'm very sorry I couldn't be with you for the entirety of the conference. So when I first spoke with Amar about this a couple of years ago, I got very, very excited because it's the kind of stuff that I've sort of been feeling and thinking about, this kind of translocal, transregional thinking for a number of years, but I just never had the guts or the resources or the time to do it. So I'm very, very happy to be here today. And I want to say also that the piece, A Tale of Two Modernities, was to a large extent a function of 2 or 3 things. One of them is sort of my own intellectual biography, which I don't want to talk about too much. But suffice to say that in the mid-90s, when I was doing my PhD, I was very interested in understanding social, cultural transformations in the Arab world, more specifically back then in Lebanon. And I could not find much in the literature on the Arab world that was very helpful. But as luck would have it, my friends, my junta in grad school were a bunch of Latin Americans, Latin American graduate students, and they started saying, hey, read this, read that, read this, read that. And so I wrote this very weird dissertation which uses a lot of Latin American cultural and media theory, particularly Garcia Canclini, but also people like Jesus Martin Barbero, to try to understand Lebanon. And it's after, 20 years now, that there's a group of people who don't think that that's very weird. So that's sort of the personal thing. The other thing is, just when I got the invitation to write this piece, Saudi Arabia was in the news for all the reasons that I think this room doesn't need to be introduced to. A new crown prince is making all kinds of grand announcements, grand gestures about bringing Saudi Arabia into modernity, making all kinds of arguments about sort of the temporality of Saudi modernity, that before 73 everything was fine and dandy, and somehow now we're going to return to that era. But there were also the kind of borderline science fiction-ish talk of a city of robots, a smart city with millions of sensors running on big data, where robots would take really the role of citizens. And so I thought I would do this comparing Abdullah al-Ghaddami, who's a prolific Saudi writer, but I was mostly interested in his book, Hikayat al-Hadatha, The Tale of Modernity in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with Nestor Garcia Canclini's Culturas Híbridas, just because so on one hand, the sort of connections, the echoes were too obvious between the two, that I felt, well, they can't be that obvious, and this is a chance to dive into it. So, and I start the piece with this famous sentence by Garcia Canclini in the prologue of Culturas Híbridas, where he says that in Latin America we have, quote, exuberant modernism with a deficient modernization. Now, of course, I take this as a provocation. I don't buy the argument that, you know, modernization and modernism are sort of, one is cultural, literally aesthetic, and the other one is sort of socioeconomic, technological, political. But I thought this would be an interesting point of departure, and beginning to look, for example, at some of the, let's say, the official ideologies prevalent in places like Mexico and Saudi Arabia. So in Mexico, of course, there's the sort of the ideology of mestizaje that it shares with a lot of Latin American countries, where it's ostensibly a mixed culture that nonetheless, of course, preserves power relations in a certain arrangement, and does not like to talk about it. So it's mixed, but some people are more mixed than others. And there's a ruling group that's not as mixed as the others. You know, I mean, all of you know more about this. On the other hand, in Saudi Arabia, where we have, you know, Wahhabiyya comes as close as they come to an official ideology. So I started digging, looking into the work of these two people to sort of establish something that's very dear to me, which is sort of what I call south-to-south linkages that a lot of people in this room do as well. So, and I used in the piece, I used the metaphor of, if we look at these two works and their definition, the way they grapple with modernity, one metaphor that would help us understand is, think of, they're looking at a valley from two different peaks. There are obvious overlaps, but the vision, the other vision is not clear from the standpoint from which you're looking at it. I discussed how the two books were published about 15 years apart. Culturas Híbridas came in 1980. Grijalbo published it in Barcelona, in Mexico City, and Buenos Aires, and it took about 12, 13 years for the University of Minnesota Press to issue the first translation. Hikayat al-Hadatha fi al-Mamlaka al-Saudiyya al-Arabiyya was never translated. It's still in Arabic. It doesn't circulate in the same way, so there are obvious differences on that regard. Nestor Garcia Canclini became sort of a global commodity in cultural studies. Here's somebody who gives you like the authentic Latin American perspective on cultural study, whatever that means. So the two people have very different spheres of influence, very different spheres of circulation. Now, how do they define modernity? So a few things. Al-Ghaddami's book is really a personal. It's an autobiography that couples with a political manifesto about sort of the Saudi modernity wars, that couples with sort of theoretical treatise about what cultural modernity means. Al-Ghaddami has devoted most of his life to fight what he calls an-nasq al-muhafidh. My best translation is the conservative mode, but I'm sure there are better translations. He argues that modernity is self-reflexive, so it's an awareness of a critical awareness towards tradition. He argues that modernity is multiple, so there are multiple forms of modernity. On the other hand, according to Al-Ghaddami, modernity comes as a total package, so you cannot negotiate it. right? You cannot, he talks about the modernity of means versus the modernity of mentalities, so, which means you cannot buy all the gadgets and pretend to be modern without changing your way of thinking, which obviously causes a lot of problems in Saudi Arabia. If you look at the kind of modernity that's now official policy in Saudi Arabia, it is really a modernity of gadgets. It's not a modernity of changing social relations, of changing political arrangements, of any kind of radical change in society. Another thing that's interesting to me is that modernity for Al-Ghaddami is a very national project. And he looks at the media, which was really my main interest since that's my field, as an incubator of a national modernity. In contrast, what's interesting about Garcia Conclini is he sees media as connectors between different national and cultural spheres that sort of bring about the genesis of a truly hybrid culture, right? So there are very important differences in that regard. Other differences, whereas Al-Ghaddami talks of cultural schizophrenia, which for those of us who work sort of the history of ideas in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, it's a very prevalent trope, while Garcia Conclini talks about cultural reconversion, cultural transmutations, right, in his famous notion of hybridity. Whereas Al-Ghaddami talks about direct political confrontation with the conservatives in Saudi Arabia. Garcia Conclini talks about oblique powers, talks about struggles. But I think what's most interesting to me in the differences between them is the kind of teleology, is the kind of very linear sense of history that Al-Ghaddami seems to espouse. He talks about Saudi modernity being born out of poetry in the 1940s, 1950s, then amplified in the emergence of columnists. He argues that sort of the individual authorial voice in the Saudi press was something very important. And then the next stage is television, and then finally the internet. So it's a very sort of media-centric, media-deterministic, linear sense of history. While for Garcia Conclini, of course, he adopts the sort of tiempos mixtos perspective, where different temporalities mix to create and shape daily experience, no matter when it is located, right? And he has this very famous passage in Culturas Híbridas where he used the Plaza de las Tres Culturas in Tlatelolco in Mexico City to say, look, we have this sort of hyper-modern skyscraper, we have a colonial cathedral, and we have an Aztec pyramid from pre-colonial Mexico. This is sort of a metaphor that captures for him this notion of tiempos mixtos. And finally, I think I would like to conclude by saying that one of the most interesting things about sort of comparing these people and comparing the way they think is to realize that they do agree on something fundamental, which is that modernity is a process. Modernity is not an outcome. It's not a situation. It's not a status. It is not a lived experience that is frozen in time, but rather modernity is a historical process, even if they disagree on how history moves, how history advances. And I think that's very interesting. Another thing that if you follow what they're doing now, so I've never met Abdallah al-Ghaddami. I've invited Nestor to Penn, and we spent a day together walking in Philadelphia. One of the most interesting things about him is when I asked him what you wanted to see, he said, I don't want to see, he's interested in architecture. I don't want to see anything that was built before 2000, which if you're from Philadelphia, there are like 3 buildings, and now there are more. But it was a very interesting, here's somebody who talks about cultural hybridity, here's somebody who talks about understanding modernity as a connection between, post-modernity as a connection between the modern and the traditional, but he's really not interested in anything that is not very contemporary and very modern. But I want to end with, I think, what to me is the sort of the fulcrum of Nestor's definition of modernity. And this is at the end of Culturas Híbridas, and it's really a beautiful sentence. And here's what he says. He says, modernity is, quote, an unending transit in which the uncertainty of what it means to be modern is never eliminated. To radicalize the project of modernity is to sharpen and renew this uncertainty, to create new possibilities for modernity, always to be able to be something different and something more. So I really love this because in a way you can't go wrong. You can just, it's a very inspiring, sort of provocative invitation to understanding modernity on its own term, which are always changing, not only depending on context, but even within context, never to take modernity for granted. Thank you.
Okay. It's not really morning, late morning, but good morning. I mean, we're academics, so when do our mornings start? That's the whole point. Well, I want to thank the workshop organizers and also these two magazines. I've been involved with MERIP for several years now, and actually the article here, the title of this talk is the name of the article that I wrote, and it's free. It's on the MERIP site. So I'm not going to go too much into the nitty-gritty of the article. You're welcome to read it yourself. It takes 15 minutes. But I do want to say something personal. I almost became a Latin Americanist, like many Americans growing up, learning Spanish in high school, becoming politicized in college. I thought I was going to chase the revolution south of the border, like many Americans, whether it was Cuba in the 60s, Nicaragua in the 80s, or Venezuela and Bolivia, in the 2000s. I actually went to Venezuela right after the coup attempt and stayed there for a while and traveled around Venezuela. Thankfully, I had an undergrad advisor who told me everybody who learns Spanish in high school becomes a Latin Americanist, and probably not very well, and it's a very saturated field. Why don't you go chase another revolution, the Iranian Revolution? And that's what I actually ended up doing later on. So it's nice to have an opportunity to return to actually my interests in Latin America, and I wanted to take this article as an exercise in comparative logics and see what comparisons can do. The article is prompted by a recent report that was published by the well-known economist Thomas Piketty. And he has now this kind of super group of economists, and they are putting out lots of data about inequalities all around the world, and India, China, obviously Europe and the US, historical data, and contemporary data on how unequal income earning across the world is, and they finally got to the Middle East. And last December, he and his team, some graduate students in Paris, put out a report on inequality in the Middle East, comparing inequality in the Middle East to other world regions. And the headline of their report was that the Middle East, as a region in and of itself, as a kind of regional unit, notwithstanding all of the discussion yesterday about the boundaries, which I take that point, but their particular Middle East is the most unequal region in the world. That was the headline news from the report. Now, I had been working on inequality in the Middle East, and from what I had read, I remember inequality in the Middle East being relatively low compared to other regions in the global south, most specifically Latin America, which has historically been known for relatively high levels of income and social inequality across the 20th century. So here's the kind of big chart from their report. And these are the share of income in each of these units going to the bottom 50% of all individuals, the middle 40% of all individuals, if you stack income of individuals from bottom to top, and then the top 10%. So for example, in Western Europe, the top 10% of Western Europe as a unit, 420 million people, garner about 38% of the income. The United States is higher, but here's different regions in the global south. Of course, we know that South Africa, for example, and Brazil are very well known for having high inequality due to legacies of colonialism and slavery in Brazil, and obviously kind of apartheid in South Africa, and both revolve around land issues. But here's the Middle East. And the Middle East, the top 10% in their unit, like the Middle East as a unit of all the people in the Middle East, garner about 61% of total incomes. Now, I consider this a puzzle because most economists, and I'm not an economist, most economists who write about the Middle East say that The big states in the Middle East, like Egypt, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, before at least 2011, had relatively low inequality for the global south. And in fact, they always presented this as a kind of a puzzle. If inequality is relatively low in places like Egypt and Syria, why all the fuss? Economists don't understand why people protest. It's a big mystery for them. So what's all the fuss? What are they rebelling against in low inequality countries? Okay. So actually, Piketty has some interesting things to say about this, but I took this opportunity to actually unpack the roots towards regional inequality in the article. And in fact, I took the opportunity to go back in history and rethink how actually Latin America and Middle East, although they're both large and have varied histories inside, I put some stylized facts forward, as economists would say, about these distinct roots to high inequality, and how, in fact, the distinctiveness is important to understand the political outcomes in the two regions. And yet today, 2018, there's much in common between the two regions. So I'm just going to run a bit through those points and then come to 2018 through this circuitous route. So I make the argument that there are different paths to high inequality through the 20th century in Latin America compared to the Middle East. And of course, in Latin America, we know that that land has always been a serious issue which drives high inequality. Not just access to land and the ability of landowning classes to maintain control over politics, even when land itself is not useful as an asset, but the way in which landholding historically in Latin America, even with attempts to engage in land reform, radical and otherwise over many decades, continue to reproduce the social exclusion of lots of individuals from these various societies, whether indigenous groups in Latin America or Afro-descendant groups. Those are the main groups that tend to fall at the bottom of the inequality ladder in Latin America. In the Middle East, I make the argument, at least, that in the post-independence period, there was actually a much more radical move towards land reform. If you take, and at the time, of course, the left was very critical of it was the left's idea, but the authoritarian states, whether it's Egypt or Iran, Syria, engaged in it, took the idea and engaged in it. Nevertheless, I think some historians would admit that land reform in the Middle East was more radical than we realized at the time. It did not produce the kind of peasant-holding class that land reform did maybe in China or in East Asia, which was part of that region's kind of economic trajectory. Nevertheless, it did have an effect on the countryside, and coupled with big states with big public sectors that kind of extended social safety nets from the top down, and then created a floor, like in Egypt or Iran, created a kind of floor for absolute consumption. That compressed inequality in these big states in the Middle East and kind of peaked in the 1970s. And so the route to lower inequality in the Middle East has to do with a combination of land reform, of the state expanding and reaching down in a different way probably than some states in Latin America, and also making a floor at the bottom. This is the consumption floor. And so that's, by the 1980s, you have this big difference in Latin America and Middle East. But there's another difference I wanted to stress. Not so much about economics, but more about politics. And it's a major difference, I think, that Middle East scholars haven't taken seriously enough. And Latin American scholars know quite well that Latin America went through two transformations in the 1980s and the 1990s. The first was democratization. The pacted transitions from military dictatorships to at least procedurally democratic institutional processes. And it also went through stark neoliberalization. And I make the point in the essay that the term neoliberal, some people in the audience are academics, some are activists, some are just, interested parties. The term neoliberal, I would say, is almost run its course. It means too much. And in fact, it's used to mean everything. I can't remember a talk that I haven't seen where someone hasn't used the N-word, neoliberal, to mean everything under the sun. So at some point, I think the term has actually lost its analytical edge. And so if you read scholarship on the Middle East, everything is neoliberal. Malls, streets, obviously militaries, everything. Individuality, the way that Islam, everything is basically neoliberal. So I think we've lost the ability to describe variation and change through an overdependence on this catch-all concept. And the way to understand the difference is to look at Latin America. This is a region, although with internal variation, that actually went through much more rapid dislocation of social life through kind of classically understood neoliberalism. And this did not occur across the region in the Middle East the same way. And I would argue that it's actually, you can't understand the Middle East very well by solely relying on the concept of neoliberalism. One of the reasons is that, and I make the point in the piece, is that the Middle East became the main site of war and war preparation from the 1970s on to the present. And war, allowed states to basically hold off, or at least claim to the United States that they couldn't shrink their states, they couldn't cut programs, and the United States in many cases did not pressure states like Egypt or Jordan the same way they pressured states like Mexico and Brazil. And that's a big distinction. For better or for worse, the social safety nets of the Middle East did not collapse like they did in Latin America. And you don't get upticks in inequality the same way you get in Latin America. But you also get the preservation of military and authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, often with US backing. So democratization plus neoliberalism in Latin America, and none of those, if you want to make a stark comparison. In the Middle Eastern case. Obviously, you can find lots of examples in the Middle East of selling off, public sector companies, kind of letting social safety nets ossify. But the starkness of Latin America is a useful comparison. I think Middle East scholars haven't looked enough to compare the two. Nevertheless, how do we get this then? How do we get this? Well, if you go inside of the data that Piketty uses, what is inside of this unit called the Middle East? Well, they basically, they draw the borders based on the surveys they have from Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iran, Turkey, Syria to a bit, but basically the Gulf states. So there's some data from the Persian Gulf states on inequality, including the non-citizen residents of, Saudi, of Qatar, of these places. So surprise, surprise, this is mostly being driven by Gulf states. Both internally inside the Gulf, the huge disparities of income between citizen nationals and everyone else who resides in these territories. And of course, in a place like Saudi, there's majority nationals, over 50% are Saudi nationals. But in the other, more the kind of archipelago of city-states in the Gulf, they're minority nationals. The large majority of residents are not citizens. Okay, so there's a huge inequality, and that's actually been growing over time in this particular region. And of course, this region has been moving to the top of the Middle East as a whole. And that's related to the politics. Because after 4 decades of war, both international and intrastate inside of the region, the economic and political leadership of the Middle East has shifted to the Gulf states, as we were just discussing earlier. So for example, here's the income ratio from Piketty's report between nationals and foreigners in these various Gulf states. So UAE, the Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, you see actually over time, the ratio between the nationals and everyone else inside of these regions, inside of these kind of units, has gone up. So extreme inequality in the Gulf that is basically sitting at the top of the region as a whole. So the inequality actually tells us something, but it's inequality between states, between the kind of political and economic leaders of the region and everyone else, That's the kind of puzzle that I pull out. And that trajectory says something about the Middle East. In fact, it's a bit distinct. Okay. That being said, like in a case like Brazil, it's a single country inside of one country. Nevertheless, the Middle East is divided by states. And in fact, the power of states to concentrate income and the power of kinship or fictive kinship in the Gulf to also accumulate income at the top is really driving these inequality dynamics. So nevertheless, there are similarities between the regions after a century of distinction. And I just want to put on three, and I think Alejandro asked us to provoke some discussion for future projects. So here we go. I think that the similarity between the two regions can be seen in the stark violence which has disrupted social fabrics. In one region it's called crime, in another region it's called war. But when you go down on the micro level to the everyday level, you will see a lot of similarities of individuals being pushed out of particular life worlds and being forced to take part in markets of violence. Another similarity between the two is the economic dependence of these regions on the rest of the world. It seems in many ways that they're back where they started. Here is the share of global GDP of different world regions. MENA is the yellow at the bottom there, and Latin American and Caribbean is the gray. It's bigger just basically because of its population size, but this is the trajectory in the post-60s of both of these regions in their contributions to world GDP, which means that they're still basically primary commodity producers or low-wage labor, low-wage labor export. They export people or they export products with low-wage labor in it. And so these two regions are highly dependent on the world economy. And I was, in the article I say if the U.S. sneezes and China gets a cold, then these two regions will actually have major contractions, which will drive, I would imagine, drive politics even further to the right. And lastly, what does capitalism look like? So instead of neoliberalism, I'd like to use the word capitalism for these regions. What does capitalism look like in Latin America and the Middle East today? I actually think there's a lot of similarities. And the similarities aren't necessarily through the military. There was an excellent presentation by Paul Amar on military economies yesterday. But I actually think the problem is much larger than just militaries, because militaries and their subcontracted companies are a subset of a larger organizational type, which is common all around both regions, which is like the conglomerate, the business conglomerate, which has its fingers in basically every possible economic pie. Think about Odebrecht in Latin America, or a company like Etisalat in the Gulf. These are companies that are huge. They diversify into every possible industry, into finance. They're connected to states. They actually drive politics in the region. And they are a kind of link between global finance capital and transformations of economies inside of these regions. So in fact, if there's a grad student out there who wants to do a comparative dissertation on the two regions, looking at the history of business conglomerates is a very fruitful option. And very few people have written about it because they assume that these conglomerates will eventually wither when exposed to the competition of the global market. But in fact, they thrive. Business conglomerates in Mexico, think about Carlos Slim's conglomerate. They thrive in the neoliberal era. In fact, I can't find an economist who can actually explain this, by the way, because they expect these companies to go away. But in fact, they're thriving, and in the Middle East and in Latin America, actually driving politics, and they're driving change. So those are kind of the three similarities between the regions that have come at the end of a century of transformation and now high inequality. Anyway, thank you so much. Thanks for the conference, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, good morning once again. Our paper that we're going to be presenting is also available on MERIP.org. We're going to be reading parts of it and leave you wanting more, hopefully. And similar to Kevan's paper, it's also more political economy, which I know people love on Saturday late mornings. You just can't have enough. So, here we go. Over the past several years, posters of a great Chinese terracotta warrior have caught the eyes of travelers at international airports. Hung along walls alongside moving walkways, the posters advertise the London-based bank HSBC and feature photographs ironically labeled with a sentence starting, "In the future." The campaign was designed to portray HSBC at the cutting edge of banking and commerce worldwide. In one particular poster, everything about the image was similar to the famous terracotta warrior statues, except for one detail. Instead of boots, the warrior wore bright yellow and green flip-flops. Over the photo was the line, "In the future, South-South trade will be norm, not novelty," end quote. 4 sentences below, the photograph elaborated on the idea. Quote, "Direct trade between fast-growing nations is reshaping the world economy. HSBC is one of the leading banks for trade settlement between China and Latin America. There is a new world emerging, be part of it," end quote. It may not have been the creator's intentions, but the poster unwittingly captures an increasingly salient feature of South-South relations. In the Chinese-Latin American trade relationship, the photo implies the Chinese contribute the mighty warrior and the Latin Americans make the flip-flops. Many of the essays in this historic NACLA MERIP collaboration examine the evolving nature of Latin America and Middle East relations with respect to changing North-South political and economic relations. But what is also noteworthy is the way South-South relations themselves have evolved. In the 1950s, intellectuals from Latin America and the Middle East, including structuralists and dependentistas like the Argentine Raul Prebisch and Egyptian Samir Amin, formulated their advocacy for South-South relations as a response to unequal North-South development. They and others challenged mainstream economic theory, which maintained that free trade benefited both rich and poor countries, and demonstrating instead that global exchanges were fundamentally unequal and that free trade works to benefit the industrialized global North to the detriment of the largely agrarian South. Today, many scholars of both regions are sounding the alarm on South-South relations. As the image of the mighty Chinese warrior suggests, despite the possibilities for an alternative source of finance, trade, and technology transfer, the risk of unequal development and deindustrialization between nations of the South looms. The past 30 years has in fact seen a boom in South-South economic relations that never materialized during the golden years of the Third World era, when many of those structuralists were formulating their advocacy for South-South trade. From the post-World War II decades of the 1950s until the 1980s, South-South trade represented roughly 5 to 10% of global trade. However, from the period of 1990 to 2000, this 10-year period, the number increased from 10 to 16%. By 2005, it was 20%, and by 2013, 31% of all global trade was between or among countries considered among the global South. In 1950, for example, exports from the South to the rest of the world accounted for approximately 30% of world trade, and by 2013, that share had risen to 54%. Over the same period, the direction of those exports shifted. By 2013, about 60% of all Southern exports were shipped to other South countries. Global South-South financial flows have also risen. The share of the global South in world foreign direct investment, for example, increased from less than 30% in 1970 to over 60% in 2013. So during this time period, the global South has become a major investor, increasing its share in global FDI outflows from 1/3 of 1% to below 40%, just below 40%. And more than 60% of those flows in 2013 went to other Southern countries. However, there are major differences between that era of third worldism in the post-war period until today. First, the third world movement, whether working through the non-line movement, the G77, or UNCTAD, was built on a relatively radical critique of the global economy as inherently unequal and exploitative for the global South. The post-1990s wave of South-South relations, however, has taken place in an era of, neoliberal globalization, where many developing countries.
Still gotta use it.
We have to.
Yeah, one time.
One time, sorry. He used it more than we did. He used it 3 times. Have abandoned their industrial development model in favor of import substitution industrialization in favor of export-led growth. The pink tide of left-wing Latin American governments emerging in the late 1990s spurred the development of South-South initiatives such as ALBA and the Cochabamba declarations for Latin American unity. However, the recent surge in South-South relations is by large being led by developing countries that have embraced global capitalism. A second major difference between then and now is that a significant push for increasing South-South ties, including South-South trade agreements, emanates from multinational corporations interested in South-South economic liberalization to solidify global commodity supply chains. In a world of decreasing North-North and North-South tariff barriers, South-South tariffs were one of the last remaining obstacles for universal free trade. And therefore, dismantling South-South trade barriers serves both to streamline production processes as well as allow multinational corporations to use certain South countries as launching pads or export platforms to export regionally. This may help explain the surprising embrace of South-South trade by entities such as the WTO, which includes among its main goals lowering trade barriers worldwide. Third, and perhaps most alarmingly, the most alarming difference is the dramatic level of inequality within the global South, particularly in industrialization and technological development. Most of the rise of South-South trade is captured by a few countries, primarily China and other emerging Asian economies who account for the lion's share of trade and financial flows. The rest of the global South, on these terms, is lagging further behind. The situation raised the possibility that economic interactions under the banner of South-South trade can create just as much inequality as traditional North-South trade, particularly when it comes to trade in industrial products.
The global rise in commodity and oil prices in the mid-2000s was a mixed blessing to both regions, as we know. It allowed governments to buffer social demands without seriously addressing imbalances in their economic bases. The meteoric rise of China on a global level, particularly after its entry into the WTO in 2001, intensified relations between the rapidly industrializing country and the rest of the global South. The Third World Movement was dominated back then by the likes of Egypt's Nasser, Yugoslavia's Tito, and India's Nehru. But at the time of the Bandung Conference, which I think Omar referenced earlier, China was hoping to get a foothold in Afro-Asian affairs to escape its isolation by the United States and the Soviet Union. Its level of industrialization lagged significantly behind others such as Brazil and Argentina. Today, of course, the opposite is true. The Chinese economy reigns supreme in the global South, and the tables have turned significantly. Despite the possibilities for alternative sources of finance, trade and technology transfer brought about by China's presence, both regions' trading patterns with China are now highly unequal. For example, in 2012, 74% of Argentine and 61% of Chilean exports to China were of basic unprocessed products or primary commodities. Together with natural resource intensive manufacturers, so low technology products that are mainly developed by processing raw materials, primary goods accounted for 92% of Argentine and 99% of Chilean exports to China in 2012. So this is sort of a dramatic overdependence on raw material exports. Even in the case of more successful industrializing countries such as Brazil, the future looks grim as 92% of Brazilian exports to China were of either primary commodities or natural resource intensive manufactures. Similarly, over 76% of China's imports from the Middle East are in primary products or natural resource intensive manufacturers, while about 70% of its own exports to the region are in relatively sophisticated and high technology products. China's rise, therefore, is not only resulting in unequal trade relations between these regions. In fact, its entry into the WTO, in fact, helped to crowd out Latin American and Middle Eastern industrial exports in third regions due to their higher quality or cheaper prices. This has very much been kind of a race to the bottom. In regions long mired in webs of Euro-American influence and power, the arrival of a counterweight at least offers an opportunity to balance different interests against each other, hopefully, of course, with the kind of caution born of decades of experience navigating and resisting imperial and neo-imperial designs. After all, China did not create Bretton Woods, nor has it, as yet, engineered and mandated ruinous structural adjustment policies by controlling financial institutions of its making, as, of course, the liberalizing policies of the Washington Consensus did through the World Bank and the IMF. Nor has China proven as yet interested in overthrowing governments in Latin America at will, as the United States did when, of course, it backed the ouster of Honduran President Manuel Zelaya in 2009, or Paraguayan President Fernando Lugo in 2012, or Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. So to be sure, allegations of corruption and mismanagement of Chinese funds, which in large part to reference the Odebrecht comment that Kavan made, that these raise serious questions about transparency and the rule of law. And these grave issues, as well as trade and financial imbalances, reveal structural deficits and long-term governance challenge in the regions themselves more than they indicate newfound imperial ambitions, at least as yet. The Global South will need to tackle these issues and do so quickly if it is to turn incipient efforts at cooperation into lasting changes in global geopolitics. For now, what is clear is that the rise of China, along with other large countries of the Global South, and their active role in the WTO and other global fora disrupting the supremacy of the United States, the European Union, Canada, and Japan, has created significant possibilities for autonomous human development that did not exist in the 1980s and 1990s. So what we believe is that more and more the future of the Global South is in its own hands, both in terms of its possibilities and its potential mistakes. Thank you. Thank you.
I have to apologize. I'm losing my voice. And although I usually speak very loudly and very fast, I have to be a little slow. But I try to be very brief. Thank you. These are very, very thoughtful and interesting papers or presentations. What I would like to do is to raise some questions, but these are really my reflections. Don't feel obligated necessarily to respond to my questions. These are really areas based on reading your papers, necessarily not your presentations, that I would like to know more or explore collectively. On Professor Padilla's paper, although your presentation is rather different from the paper I read, or it's a different, my questions or my reflections are mostly based on your experience as a teacher with students in Tehran. It seems that you are making two, from my perspective, very interesting theoretical suggestions based on your experience in Iran. One, based on your own, this sort of transnational experience that you had in Iran, you're making the point that these sort of transnational, transcultural references can be a platform for a much deeper understanding of societies, in this case, perhaps Spanish-speaking world, and Iran, or maybe even Middle East, but certainly Iran. In having a conversation on better mutual understanding of each other's histories and cultures. I find this very interesting, particularly because you seem to be fed up with this neoliberal overuse of neoliberalism, and I agree with your fatwa that we should not use neoliberalism except for one time. But also this obsession with relationship between, say, in this case, Iran in particular, and the West, which I am probably can be accused of writing several books on that. It's so refreshing to move on to something else. And so I really like your first argument. And the second argument is that, however, what impedes a more interesting and open dialogue on histories and cultures and politics between this region is, I would say, a little too much politics or ideological political states. And I assume that this reference is mostly on Iran and the Islamic Republic and sort of politicization of culture. So in this context, I have two reflections or two questions that I would like to learn a little more based on your paper. One is that what are the theoretical or conceptual resources that these students that you work with utilize in speaking about one theme of your paper, imperialism? For instance, are these references purely ideological or state-sponsored ideas, or the left discourse has some space here? I didn't get it from the paper. I am very curious in learning and knowing more about this. And my last question is, really it's not a question because this is not the topic of your paper, but I would have liked to see more in the context of your very interesting theoretical suggestions is, well, there is also a pretty rich tradition of surreal literature in Iran. What I'm wondering on is these young Iranian students, I'm assuming that they're undergraduate students, what is their understanding of work of, say, perhaps the most important surreal Iranian novelist, Sadegh Hedayat? I know that sort of in the Islamic Republic, Hedayat is a taboo name. But is that tradition part of the conversation, or is it just Latin American tradition that is discussed? Moving to Professor Kraidy's very interesting presentation, but also something that I have been thinking for a long time about. And personally, I'm very interested in, although I'm losing my energy and I'm going to be more brief. I actually see your theoretical ideas in conversation with someone who I actually admire and also was a friend of mine from New York, Marshall Berman. This whole discussion of the either coupling or tension between modernity, between modernization and modernism, I find really, really fascinating. And I hope at some point, or maybe next year when we have this conference, we have a panel on that. I think it was further exploration. So you make the argument that or you conclude, I think this was also in your presentation, that modernism and modernizations are not dichotomies, but couplings yielding multiple permutations. Very interesting, but I would say more controversial statement that you generously presented it today in your presentation. But in that context, what I would like to know is that what are possible linkages that exist between Al-Qahtani's, I would say, pragmatic Hegelian view of the unified modern self and his very conservative politics from a modernist perspective, not from his own universe, but from perspective of, say, someone like Marshall Berman. and what are the implications of that? And my second and last reflection on this is that in the context of your discussion of hybrid cultures, or I assume that it also means hybrid modernity. And very interesting suggestion that dismantling dualities can also recognizes important differences between sort of institutional modernity and national or local cultures and mode of life. With the collapse of all this dualism, is there still any room for recognizing democratic and perhaps anti-democratic states or political institutions? Or this dismantling of dualism is so vast and so complex that posing the question that I'm posing, like political democracy versus, say, autocracies, are totally irrelevant to the discussion and academic debates in the context of certainly both Middle East and Latin America. Professor Harris, apart from his very interesting fatwa, which I agree,
I'm never going to use that word. That one.
yeah, you don't need my support, probably. I found your, of course, your paper very interesting, and I learned quite a lot. I am not capable of really posing that much engaging or any smart point to you except for one. And I want to be very careful in how to pose it because I'm not really critical. I'm just, this is really a suggestion, right? So I see that your very coherent and focused and sharp discussion focuses on states and state policy and up, down, or processes from top to down. You are a sociologist, so I don't want to ask you economic questions because I'm so bad on that. Do you see both, in historically speaking, but also in the future, but certainly in the context of your discussion, any role for social movements and anything that comes outside of the state in that process? It would be nice to know. And lastly, our two organizers who have spent so much time on really making this very unique and almost historic event of speaking about South and South. I have to be careful in making sure that I express my appreciation to you, but I have some reflections and questions. I will be very brief. I'm so happy that I didn't use my voice.
Found your voice.
What I would like to know more in your, based on your presentation, is that apart from ideological politics, that it seems that you clearly stated and explored here, what other factors are part of this, what you call South and South relations now? And I say this in the context of my second point. So it seems to me, if I'm not mistaken, that you make the argument that the Bandung egalitarian vision was very powerful and in a way shaped this South-South relationship between 1980s in a way that it was sharply different from what is going on now. If that interpretation, it's my interpretation of your paper is right, is what is missing now? Is it that Bandung vision was so powerful? Is it merely ideological, or are there economic, institutional, or other new elements into the South-South relationship that makes it so, based on your paper, I think this is your argument, very troubling, very unequal? And my last and final comments and what do you think? This is like asking the magical question that what do you think accounts for the loss of appeal of the egalitarian vision in the third world, that it seems that is now, and also the left in general, it's not just the Bandung conference, that have lost itself, both from at the state level, but also at the popular level. Thank you so much.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. We started at 10:45, so we're going to go till 12:10, 12:15. We have our lovely mic runner who will be giving you the microphone. Are there any questions? Okay. We have two. Sorry.
My question